The fluorescent lights of St. Mary's Hospital cast harsh shadows across the emergency room as Maria Santos clutched her 8-year-old son's hand. Blood stained his school uniform, and his breathing came in shallow, desperate gasps. The motorcycle had come out of nowhere on their walk home from church, leaving little Miguel broken on the asphalt just steps from their apartment. "We need to operate immediately." Dr. Richardson's voice cut through the chaos of beeping monitors and rushing nurses. "But I have to be honest with you. There's internal bleeding we can't control, and our surgical team is tied up for the next 3 hours." His eyes held the weight of impossible choices. "I'm not sure we have 3 hours." Maria's world tilted. The rosary beads her own mother had pressed into her hands 20 years ago suddenly felt burning hot in her pocket. Around them, other families waited in their own private hells, but none of them seemed to face what she was facing. The doctor was telling her there was no time left, yet no way to save her son. Before we go deeper into this mystery, take a moment to subscribe to Virgin Mary Mysteries. Stories like this are too powerful to experience alone. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? And if you feel moved, share a short prayer or phrase from your heart. Sometimes our words of faith reach further than we know. She thought of her mother's final words. "When there's nowhere left to turn, Mija, you turn to Our Lady. She understands a mother's heart." Maria had been Miguel's age when cancer took her mother, leaving her with nothing but stories of miraculous interventions and a worn rosary that had traveled from Mexico City to this sterile American hospital room. But this wasn't a story. This was her son's life slipping away with every labored breath. The monitors showed his blood pressure dropping. Dr. Richardson kept glancing at his watch, then at the surgical schedule, his frustration evident in every gesture. Other medical staff whispered in urgent tones about protocol and timing, but their words felt distant, like voices from another world. Maria's knees hit the cold linoleum floor beside Miguel's gurney. Her hand found the silver crucifix at her throat, the same one her mother had worn through countless nights of prayer. Around her, the emergency room continued its relentless pace, but in this moment, there was only a mother's whispered plea and the steady beeping of machines that measured the time she had left. "Blessed Mother," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the medical equipment. "If you're listening, if you remember what it's like to watch your child suffer, please, I have nothing left but this prayer." But could a prayer spoken in desperation really change what seemed medically impossible? Maria Santos had learned about impossible odds long before this night in St. Mary's Hospital. 23 years earlier, she had knelt beside another hospital bed, watching her own mother fight a battle that medicine couldn't win. Rosa Santos had been only 32, a young widow raising her daughter alone in a cramped apartment above the bakery where she worked 16-hour days to keep them afloat. The cancer had moved quickly, but Rosa's faith had remained unshakable. Even as chemotherapy stole her thick black hair and morphine clouded her gentle eyes, she would finger her rosary beads and whisper the same prayers her grandmother had taught her in the mountains of Guadalajara. "This rosary has seen miracles, Mija," she had told 8-year-old Maria during one of their last conversations. "My abuela carried it when she fled the revolution, and it brought her safely to this country. It will protect you too." Maria had inherited more than just the silver beads with their worn crucifix. She had inherited stories of Our Lady appearing to desperate mothers, of impossible healings, of protection that came when all earthly help had failed. Throughout her teenage years, through community college and late-night shifts at the same bakery where her mother had worked, Maria had carried those stories like seeds of hope. When she became pregnant with Miguel at 19, unmarried and frightened, she found herself kneeling in the same church where her mother had prayed for healing. The rosary beads had grown warm in her hands as she asked Our Lady for strength to raise her son alone. According to Maria, that night had marked the beginning of a series of small graces, a scholarship that paid for nursing school, a kind landlord who accepted late rent, a daycare that stayed open during her evening classes. Miguel had grown up hearing those same stories, learning to say the Rosary before bed, watching his mother light candles to the Virgin during difficult times. He knew about his grandmother Rosa, whose picture sat beside a small statue of Our Lady of Guadalupe on their kitchen table. The boy understood that faith was something you carried in your pocket, something you whispered in darkness, something that connected generations of mothers who had nowhere else to turn. But now, as the hospital's overhead pages announced surgical delays and Dr. Richardson's expression grew more grave, Maria wondered if the legacy of faith she had inherited would be strong enough for this moment. The rosary in her pocket seemed heavier now, weighted with the prayers of women who had faced impossible choices before her. Her mother's voice echoed in her memory. "The Virgin Mary knows what it means to watch your child suffer, Mija. She will not abandon you." Rosa had said those words during her final week, when pain medication could no longer touch what cancer was doing to her body. She had pressed the rosary into Maria's small hands and made her promise to never stop believing in the power of a mother's prayer. How could those silver beads, blessed by generations of desperate women, possibly change what was happening in this sterile, modern hospital? What power did ancient prayers hold against internal bleeding and empty operating rooms? As Maria's whispered prayer faded into the steady hum of hospital machinery, Dr. Richardson's pager erupted with an urgent beep. He glanced at the display, his brow furrowing in confusion. Then his expression shifted to something that looked almost like disbelief. "That's unexpected," he muttered, pulling out his phone to confirm what his pager had just told him. The surgical team that had been tied up with an emergency appendectomy had just finished, 2 hours ahead of their projected schedule. According to the head nurse, the patient had required far less intensive work than anticipated, and the operating room was being prepped for immediate availability. Maria watched the doctor's face transform as he processed this information. Just minutes before, he had been preparing her for the worst, explaining that Miguel's internal bleeding would likely prove fatal without immediate intervention. Now he was looking at her son's charts with renewed energy, calling for an immediate pre-op assessment. "Mrs. Santos," Dr. Richardson said, his voice carrying a cautious optimism that hadn't been there before, "we can take Miguel into surgery now. This opening, it shouldn't have happened. Emergency appendectomies typically take much longer, especially with the complications this patient presented." The change in the emergency room was immediate and palpable. Nurses, who had been moving with the resigned efficiency of those managing an impossible situation, suddenly shifted into the focused urgency of a real rescue mission. Miguel's gurney was being prepared for transport, IV lines checked, vitals monitored with fresh hope rather than grim documentation. Maria's hand found the rosary in her pocket, and the silver beads felt different now, warmer, almost alive with possibility. She thought of her mother's stories about divine timing, about doors opening when they should remain closed, about medical miracles that began with the smallest shifts in circumstance. If this story is pulling you in, subscribe now and tell me in the comments what you believe is really happening. Your insight might reveal something we haven't seen yet. But even as hope began to bloom in her chest, questions multiplied in her mind. The surgical team's early completion defied everything Dr. Richardson had explained about complex emergency procedures. Hospital schedules weren't known for their flexibility, and operating rooms didn't typically become available precisely when desperate mothers finished praying to the Virgin Mary. An older nurse named Patricia, who had been working the emergency ward for 30 years, paused beside Maria as they prepared to wheel Miguel toward the surgical wing. "I've never seen timing work out like this," she said quietly, her Irish accent carrying decades of hospital experience. "Usually when we tell families the OR won't be ready for hours, that's exactly how long it takes. Sometimes longer." As they moved through the hospital corridors, Maria noticed something else that struck her as unusual. The other emergency cases that had been ahead of Miguel in priority were all resolving more quickly than expected. A car accident victim who should have required extensive surgery was being cleared for observation only. A heart attack patient was responding to medication faster than his cardiologist had predicted. The entire emergency department seemed to be operating under different rules tonight, as if some invisible hand was clearing the way for one small boy's desperate need for immediate care. Maria had prayed for a miracle, but she hadn't expected it to look like a series of perfectly timed medical coincidences. Was this the answer to her prayer, or was she seeing divine intervention where there was only fortunate scheduling? The surgical suite at St. Mary's Hospital had seen thousands of emergency procedures, but what unfolded during Miguel Santos's operation would leave Dr. Sarah Chen questioning everything she thought she understood about medicine. As the lead surgeon, Dr. Chen had reviewed Miguel's scans and prepared for the worst: massive internal bleeding that would require hours of delicate work to repair. But from the moment she made her first incision, nothing proceeded according to the medical evidence that had brought them into this room. Miguel's vital signs, which had been dropping steadily in the emergency room, began to stabilize in ways that defied his injuries. His blood pressure, which should have continued falling as they worked to locate and repair the internal damage, instead held steady at levels that surprised even the anesthesiologist. Dr. Martinez, who had been monitoring Miguel's heart rate, found himself recalibrating his equipment twice, certain there had been some malfunction. "His oxygen levels are actually improving," Dr. Martinez announced to the surgical team, his voice carrying the bewilderment of a professional witnessing something beyond his training. This shouldn't be happening with this degree of trauma. In the waiting room outside, Maria sat in the chapel that adjoined the surgical wing, her mother's rosary moving through her fingers in a rhythm as old as her ancestry. Other families had joined her in the small space, not because they knew her story, but because something about her quiet, unwavering prayer seemed to draw them into the circle of candlelight and whispered petitions. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, whose husband was undergoing his third heart surgery, found herself kneeling beside Maria despite not having prayed in years. "I don't know why," she would later tell her daughter, "but sitting next to that young mother, I felt like someone was listening." Back in the operating room, Dr. Chen was encountering the second impossibility of the night. The internal bleeding that had shown up so dramatically on Miguel's CT scans was far less severe than the images had indicated. The source of the hemorrhaging, which should have required extensive surgical repair, appeared to be naturally clotting in ways that her 20 years of surgical experience had never shown her. "Dr. Chen," her surgical assistant said quietly, "are we looking at the same patient? The scans showed massive abdominal trauma, but what I'm seeing here—" "I know," Dr. Chen replied, her hands steady even as her mind raced to understand the discrepancy. "The imaging was clear, but the actual damage is significantly less than what we prepared for. His spleen should be ruptured, but it's intact. The liver laceration that showed on the scan appears to be healing already." The surgical team worked with a mixture of relief and confusion. Each of Miguel's organs showed signs of trauma consistent with being struck by a motorcycle, but the expected cascade of life-threatening complications simply wasn't materializing. Instead, his body seemed to be responding to their intervention as if some external force was supporting their efforts, strengthening their repairs, stabilizing what should have been failing. In the chapel, Maria felt a warmth spread through her chest as she whispered the 5th decade of the Rosary. The silver crucifix in her palm seemed to pulse with its own gentle heat, and she found herself remembering her mother's words about miracles that work through human hands, divine grace that flows through medical knowledge. But what was really happening in that operating room? And could Miguel's unexplained stability possibly continue through the most dangerous part of the surgery still to come? As Miguel's surgery continued with its inexplicable stability, something unprecedented began happening throughout St. Mary's Hospital. The small prayer circle that had formed spontaneously in the chapel was quietly expanding, drawing families from every floor of the medical center into an atmosphere of shared hope that veteran staff had never witnessed. Mrs. Eleanor Walsh, who had found herself praying beside Maria despite decades of religious doubt, experienced what she could only describe as a profound sense of peace wash over her as news arrived that her husband's heart surgery, his most dangerous yet, had proceeded flawlessly. The cardiac surgeon, Dr. Patel, had expected complications that simply never materialized. "I've performed this procedure hundreds of times," Dr. Patel confided to the nursing staff, but tonight felt different. It was as if every aspect of the surgery was being guided. In the pediatric intensive care unit, 3 floors above the chapel, night nurse Jennifer Martinez noticed that several young patients who had been struggling were showing unexpected improvement. A premature baby whose lungs had been failing suddenly began breathing more steadily. A child with pneumonia broke his fever for the first time in days. The changes were medically explainable, but their timing struck Jennifer as remarkable. "It started around 9:30, she would later tell her supervisor, right about when that prayer group gathered downstairs. "I've been a PICU nurse for 15 years, and I've never seen multiple patients turn the corner simultaneously like that." Back in the chapel, Maria felt a gentle touch on her shoulder. She looked up to find Father Michael, the hospital chaplain, standing beside her with tears in his eyes. He had been making his evening rounds when he noticed the unprecedented gathering of families from different floors, different faiths, different circumstances, all drawn together by what seemed to be an invisible current of grace. "My child," Father Michael said softly, "I've ministered in this hospital for 12 years. And I've never seen anything like this. Families who don't know each other, patients from different units, all experiencing what can only be described as simultaneous blessings." The rosary in Maria's hands had grown so warm that several other women asked if they could touch it, adding their own whispered petitions to the silver beads that had traveled from revolutionary Mexico to this modern American hospital. Each person who held the rosary later described feeling what they called a current of comfort flow through their hands. Dr. Richardson, who had been monitoring the situation from the surgical waiting area, found himself drawn into conversations he had never experienced in his 20-year career. Family members were sharing stories of answered prayers, unexpected recoveries, and medical outcomes that defied the odds they had been given earlier that evening. "I don't know how to explain this to my colleagues," he admitted to Father Michael, "but tonight feels different. We've had multiple procedures go better than expected, patients respond faster than predicted, and surgical complications that simply haven't materialized." The hospital's intercom system, which typically announced codes and medical emergencies, had been silent for hours, an unprecedented stretch of time for a busy emergency center. It was as if the entire building had been granted a reprieve from its usual crises, a pocket of peace that seemed to radiate outward from the small chapel where a Mexican rosary caught the candlelight. But what force could possibly coordinate such widespread grace? And would this mysterious protection extend to the most critical phase of Miguel's surgery still ahead? At 11:47 p.m., Dr. Sarah Chen stepped back from the operating table with an expression her surgical team had never seen. In her hands, she held the CT scan images that had brought Miguel Santos into emergency surgery 3 hours earlier. Her eyes moved between the scans and the small boy lying peacefully before her, his vital signs stronger than when he had arrived. "I need everyone to witness this, Doctor," Chen announced, her voice carrying the weight of discovery that would challenge everything they had learned in medical school. The imaging shows massive internal trauma, ruptured spleen, severe liver laceration, internal bleeding requiring extensive reconstruction. She paused, looking at her team. "What I found bears almost no resemblance to these scans. The spleen is intact. The liver shows minimal damage that appears to be healing rapidly. The internal bleeding has stopped completely, and the tissue repair I'm seeing should take weeks to occur, not hours. Dr. Martinez, who had been monitoring Miguel's stability throughout the procedure, examined the surgical site. His body is responding as if the trauma was far less severe than what brought him here. His blood work is normalizing faster than I've ever documented. The fourth impossibility of this extraordinary night was unfolding before their eyes. Miguel's body was healing at a rate that defied medical understanding, displaying tissue regeneration that typically occurred over months, not hours. The surgical repair Dr. Chen had expected to perform had been largely unnecessary. In the chapel below, Maria felt a profound shift as the clock approached midnight. The rosary beads in her hands had grown so warm she could feel their heat through her closed palms. Around her, families began receiving news of unexpected recoveries that exceeded every prediction. Mrs. Walsh learned her husband's heart surgery had been completed without complications, his most successful procedure despite being his most dangerous. The Martinez family heard their daughter's seizures had stopped completely for the first time in months. A young father was told his wife's emergency cesarean had resulted in healthy delivery despite earlier fears. "It's like watching grace move through this building," Father Michael whispered to Maria. "In 12 years of hospital ministry, I've never witnessed this pattern of simultaneous healing." As Maria held her mother's rosary and felt the warmth of answered prayer flowing through her hands, she realized her desperate plea to the Virgin Mary had been heard not just for Miguel, but for every family who had joined their voices to hers. The silver beads that had carried prayers from revolutionary Mexico seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a mother's heart. The same heart that had watched her own son suffer and understood the depths of a parent's love. But even as overwhelming gratitude filled Maria's chest, one question remained. What would she find when Dr. Chen finally emerged from surgery to explain the miracle that had just taken place? At 12:23 a.m., just as Dr. Chen was preparing to close Miguel's surgical incision and declare the operation a complete success, the monitors erupted in a cacophony of alarms that sent ice through every person in the operating room. Miguel's blood pressure, which had remained miraculously stable throughout the procedure, suddenly plummeted to dangerous levels. His heart rate spiked erratically, then began to slow in a pattern that every medical professional recognized as the beginning of cardiac failure. "What's happening?" Dr. Martinez demanded, his hands flying over his monitoring equipment as he searched for an explanation. "His vitals were perfect seconds ago. This doesn't make sense." Dr. Chen's trained hands moved with desperate precision as she checked for any surgical complications that could explain the sudden crisis. But the repairs she had made were holding perfectly. The minimal internal damage she had discovered was healing beautifully, and there was no medical reason for Miguel's body to be failing now, at the moment of victory. "He's going into shock," Dr. Martinez announced, his voice tight with controlled panic. "I'm losing him." The surgical team launched into the choreographed emergency protocols they had trained for throughout their careers, but nothing they tried had any effect on Miguel's declining condition. It was as if some invisible force that had been sustaining the boy throughout the surgery had suddenly withdrawn, leaving his small body to face the full trauma of his injuries all at once. In the chapel, 3 floors below, Maria felt a crushing weight descend on her chest at the exact moment Miguel's monitors began their desperate song. She didn't need a doctor to tell her that something had gone terribly wrong. She could feel it in the sudden coldness of the rosary beads, in the way the warm presence that had surrounded her all evening seemed to fade like a candle being extinguished. The other families, who had been celebrating their own miraculous answers to prayer, fell silent as they watched Maria's face transform with a mother's intuitive knowledge of her child's danger. Father Michael knelt beside her as tears began streaming down her cheeks, but she was already beyond human comfort, entering a place of prayer deeper than any she had ever known. "Sacred Mother," Maria whispered, her voice breaking with the weight of ultimate desperation, I have given you everything I am, everything I have, every prayer I know how to pray. If this is the moment when you ask me to trust you completely, then I surrender my son to your will. But please, if there is any grace left, if there is any mercy in heaven, don't let him die now when we're so close to bringing him home." The rosary in her hands had grown cold as winter stone, but Maria pressed it to her heart and continued praying with a faith that went beyond hope, beyond reason, beyond anything except a mother's love that refused to surrender even when surrender seemed like the only choice left. Upstairs, the monitors continued their relentless alarm as Miguel's life hung in the balance between human medicine and whatever mysterious force had been protecting him throughout this extraordinary night. Had Maria's faith been strong enough to sustain a miracle? Or was this the moment when even the Virgin Mary's protection would prove insufficient against the harsh realities of trauma and time? At 12:47 a.m., 24 minutes after Miguel Santos had begun his slide toward cardiac failure, the monitors in Operating Room 3 registered something that would be discussed in medical journals for years to come. Without any medical intervention beyond the standard protocols that had been failing to help him, Miguel's vital signs suddenly stabilized, then rapidly improved to levels stronger than they had been at any point since his arrival at St. Mary's Hospital. Dr. Chen, who had been preparing herself to deliver devastating news to a mother who had already endured too much, instead found herself staring at readouts that indicated complete physiological recovery. Miguel's blood pressure returned to normal ranges, his heart rate steadied, and his oxygen levels climbed to optimal numbers. The crisis that had threatened to claim his life simply ended. "I've been practicing medicine for 20 years, Dr. Chen would later tell her colleagues, "and I have no medical explanation for what happened in that operating room. None of our interventions were working, and then, suddenly, they all started working at once." When Maria finally saw her son in the recovery room, Miguel's eyes opened with a clarity that surprised everyone who had witnessed his condition just hours earlier. His first word was, "Mama," followed by a question that would give Maria chills for the rest of her life. "Why was that pretty lady in the blue dress watching over me while I was sleeping?" Maria pressed her mother's rosary into Miguel's small hand, and the boy smiled as if he recognized something familiar in the warm silver beads. "She looked just like the statue in our kitchen," he whispered, then drifted back into peaceful sleep. In the weeks that followed, St. Mary's Hospital became an unexpected pilgrimage site for families facing medical crises. Word had spread through the community about the night when multiple families had experienced simultaneous miracles, when surgical complications had resolved without explanation, when a Mexican rosary had somehow become the center of a prayer circle that seemed to draw grace like a lightning rod attracts electricity. Maria began carrying her mother's rosary to the hospital chapel every Tuesday evening, the anniversary of Miguel's accident. Other families started joining her, creating a weekly prayer group that hospital staff came to recognize as a source of unusual comfort and hope. The silver beads were touched by hundreds of desperate hands, each person adding their own petition to the accumulated prayers of generations. Dr. Chen kept copies of Miguel's before and after scans in her office, showing them to colleagues who struggled to believe that such dramatic medical reversals were possible. Father Michael included Miguel's story in his ministry training, teaching other chaplains to remain open to mysteries that transcended their theological education. If this story moved you, subscribe to Virgin Mary Mysteries so you never miss the next chapter in these extraordinary mysteries. And in the comments below, share your own prayer of protection for families in crisis. Let's create a prayer chain that reaches across every community where mothers call on Our Lady in their darkest hours. Miguel recovered completely, growing strong and healthy with no lasting effects from his injuries. But Maria never stopped wondering about the timing of each miracle that had saved her son's life. The perfect coordination of medical coincidences, the way her mother's rosary had become a channel for grace that extended far beyond one small boy's hospital room. What other mysteries might unfold for families who discover the power of calling on the Virgin Mary when there is no time left and nowhere else to turn?